Here's something most men don't realize until it's too late. A woman can love you and still take you for granted. Not because she's cruel, not because she never cared, but because your presence became predictable. You were always there, always understanding, always showing up, and slowly, without meaning to, she stopped feeling your value. Until one day, you pulled back. The messages stopped. The energy shifted. The silence appeared. And that's when something strange happened. The man she thought she didn't need suddenly became the man she couldn't stop thinking about. Not because you disappeared to manipulate her, but because your absence broke a pattern her nervous system had gotten used to. In this video, we're going to break down how women psychologically start missing the man they took for granted. Not from movies, not from dating myths, but from real female psychology. You'll understand why familiarity kills emotional attention, what actually changes in her mind when you stop chasing, when missing is driven by ego, and when it's driven by real regret, and why your growth matters more than dollars, whether she ever comes back. This isn't about winning her back. It's about understanding the dynamic so you never lose yourself trying to be chosen again. If you've ever felt overlooked, underappreciated, or like you gave more than you received, stay with me, because once you understand this, you won't chase validation anymore. You'll recognize your value whether she sees it or not. Most men assume being taken for granted happens suddenly, like one bad argument, one mistake, one moment where everything falls apart. But that's not how it actually works. Being taken for granted is almost never dramatic. It's quiet, incremental, invisible while it's happening. It starts with something that feels positive. Consistency. You show up. You listen. You forgive. You stay patient even when things feel unbalanced. At first, this feels like strength, and it is. But over time, something subtle changes in the dynamic. Your presence becomes expected. And when something is expected, the nervous system stops paying attention to it. This isn't cruelty. It's psychology. The human brain is wired to notice change, not stability. What's rare feels valuable. What's constant fades into the background. This is why familiarity can quietly kill emotional attention. Not love, not care, attention. And attention is what keeps desire alive. When you're always available, always understanding, always there, your emotional signal stops standing out. You become part of the environment, reliable, safe, predictable, and predictable, while comforting, doesn't activate awareness. This is where many men get confused. They think I'm doing everything right. I'm being mature. I'm being consistent. And they are. But consistency without boundaries slowly erodes perceived value. Because value is not about how much you give, it's about how much is felt. When your effort no longer creates emotional contrast, it stops being registered. That's when a woman can genuinely care about you and still overlook you. Not consciously. Instinctively, she doesn't wake up one day deciding to treat you like an option. She simply adapts to your presence. Your messages become routine. Your support becomes assumed. your patience becomes expected. And expected things don't create urgency. This is why being taken for granted hurts so deeply. Because from your side, nothing changed. You're still showing up with the same heart. But from her side, the emotional signal has flattened. And instead of communicating that shift clearly, many women respond unconsciously. They pull back slightly. They test boundaries. They become inconsistent, not to hurt you, but to feel something again. This is the part most men don't want to hear. When a woman tests you, she's not always trying to manipulate you. She's trying to feel. And if you respond to every test by giving more, explaining more, proving more, you don't restore balance. You deepen the imbalance, because now the dynamic shifts further. She receives. You chase. She withdraws slightly. You compensate. And, over time, a silent story forms in her mind. He'll always be there. He won't leave. I don't have to try as hard. Not because she doesn't care, but because the structure allows it. This is where men unknowingly participate in their own devaluation. Not through weakness, but through uncontained giving. Giving without standards. Giving without limits. Giving without the willingness to step back when things aren't reciprocated. And the painful truth is this. The more emotionally available you become without requiring mutual effort, the less emotional weight your presence carries. You stop being felt. That's when being taken for granted truly begins. Not when she disrespects you openly, but when she stops noticing what you provide. And here's the key insight most men miss. Being taken for granted is not about her character alone. It's about the dynamic. A dynamic where one person gives consistently and the other adjusts to receiving it. This doesn't mean you should become cold. It means consistency must be paired with self-respect. Because emotional availability without boundaries creates emotional dependency on your side and emotional complacency on hers. And that imbalance is unstable. Eventually, something has to break. Either you burn out, or the dynamic resets. This is why the shift begins when a man finally pulls back. Not out of anger, not as punishment, but because something inside him says, I can't keep showing up like this. That moment isn't weakness, it's clarity. And clarity is dangerous to a dynamic built on predictability, because the moment your presence is no longer guaranteed, the nervous system wakes up, contrast returns, and suddenly, the man who felt always there feels missing. That's when attention comes back online. Not because she suddenly realized your worth overnight, but because the routine broke, and broken routines force awareness. This is the foundation of everything that comes next. Women don't start missing a man because he disappears. They start missing him because his emotional certainty disappears. Because the version of him that always showed up without conditions is no longer there. And that absence creates space. Space for reflection. Space for comparison. Space for realization. But none of that happens if the man keeps orbiting, keeps explaining, keeps reaching, keeps hoping consistency will be rewarded. It won't. Not because love doesn't matter, but because attention follows contrast, not effort. This chapter isn't telling you to withdraw to be missed. It's showing you why being taken for granted was never about not being enough. It was about being too available without being fully respected. In the next chapter, we're going to explore what actually happens psychologically when you stop chasing. What changes inside her mind when your attention is no longer guaranteed? And why silence, when it comes from self-respect, is not abandonment but recalibration. When you stop chasing, most men think the effect is immediate. They imagine a woman suddenly panicking, blowing up their phone, or instantly realizing what she lost. That almost never happens. The real shift is quieter and far more psychological. When you pull back, the first thing that breaks is not her emotions. It's her routine. For a long time, your attention played a predictable role in her nervous system. Your messages, your check-ins, your consistency, they became part of her emotional environment. Not exciting, not dramatic, stable. And the human brain adapts quickly to stability. It stops noticing it. This is why familiarity dulls emotional attention. But the moment you stop chasing, the pattern collapses. And when a pattern collapses, the nervous system wakes up. This is where the switch happens. Not because she suddenly misses you as a person, but because her internal rhythm has been disrupted. Psychologically, attention works like dopamine regulation. When something arrives consistently, the dopamine response flattens. But when it's removed unexpectedly, the brain doesn't relax. It scans. It asks questions. It seeks explanation. That's why silence gets loud. Not on the outside, but inside her mind. At first, the reaction isn't emotional. It's cognitive. Why hasn't he reached out? Did something happen? Is he busy? Then it becomes behavioral. She checks her phone more often. She reopens old conversations. She becomes more aware of the absence. Not because she's in love again, but because certainty is gone, and certainty is deeply regulating for the nervous system. This is the part most men misunderstand. They think pulling back is a move, a tactic, a way to trigger desire. But in reality, what you're removing is not affection. You're removing predictability. And predictability is what allowed her to stop paying attention in the first place. When your presence was guaranteed, her emotional system could afford to drift. When it's no longer guaranteed, attention returns, not to chase you, but to reorient herself. This is why pulling back works even when you don't say a word. Because the silence forces internal processing. And internal processing always comes before emotion. Another important detail most men miss. When you stop chasing, her first response is rarely vulnerability. It's ego. She doesn't think, "I miss him." She thinks, "Why isn't he responding the way he used to?" That distinction matters, because ego reacts to loss of control, not loss of connection. And many women, especially those used to being pursued, don't immediately feel sadness. They feel displacement. Something is off. The emotional ground has shifted. She no longer knows where she stands. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. This is why silence is so powerful when it's authentic. Not because it's punishment, but because it removes emotional certainty without hostility. You're not arguing. You're not begging. You're not explaining. You're simply no longer orbiting. And when the orbit breaks, she can't locate you emotionally. That's when the mind starts replaying moments, conversations, patterns. But here's the key insight. The missing doesn't start because you vanished. It starts because your emotional availability was no longer free. Your energy stopped flowing outward without resistance. And that creates contrast. Contrast is what brings awareness back online. This is why men who keep chasing never trigger reflection. They keep the system regulated. They soothe uncertainty. They restore predictability. And in doing so, they remove the very conditions required for emotional reassessment. When you stop chasing, you don't create pain, you create space. Space for her to feel the absence. Space for her to notice what changed. Space for her to compare then and now. And comparison is where missing begins. This only works if your withdrawal is grounded. If you pull back out of anger, it feels hostile. If you pull back to manipulate, it feels unstable. But when you pull back because something inside you says, this dynamic doesn't feel right anymore, the silence carries weight. It has substance. It doesn't scream. It doesn't beg. It just exists. And that existence forces the question, what changed in him? That question is far more powerful than any explanation you could give. Because explanations defend, silence invites interpretation, and interpretation always leads inward. Another important truth: when you stop chasing, you are not withdrawing love. You are withdrawing unreciprocated effort. That distinction matters. Healthy withdrawal is not abandonment. It's recalibration. You're stepping out of a dynamic that required you to give more than you received. And when that dynamic collapses, the other person feels it. Not because they were malicious, but because they adjusted to imbalance, and now the imbalance is gone. This is the switch. Not a dramatic realization, not instant regret, but the beginning of awareness. In the next phase, something deeper happens. The missing shifts from ego-driven discomfort to emotional reflection. And that's where most men get confused. Because not all missing means the same thing. Some missing is about loss of control. Some missing is about loss of value. And understanding the difference is the key to not repeating the same pattern again. In the next chapter, we're going to break down that distinction clearly. The difference between ego missing and value missing, because one leads to temporary attention, the other leads to real regret. And knowing which one you're facing will determine whether walking away was the right move or simply the first step towards self-respect. This is where most men get trapped. They feel the shift. They notice the signs. She starts watching their stories again. She sends a casual message. She asks how they've been. And instantly, a thought appears. She misses me. But that thought, if left unchecked, is where men lose clarity. Because not all missing comes from the same place. And confusing the two is how men walk right back into the same dynamic that broke them. There are two very different reasons a woman starts missing a man she took for granted. They feel similar on the surface, but psychologically, they are worlds apart. The first is ego missing. Ego missing doesn't come from love. It comes from loss of control. When you were always there, her ego felt secure. She knew where she stood. She knew how much influence she had. She knew your attention was available. When you pulled back, that certainty disappeared. And the ego hates uncertainty. So her mind starts searching for reassurance. Not because she suddenly understands your value, but because she no longer feels powerful in the dynamic. Ego missing sounds like curiosity. Why hasn't he reached out? Is he mad? Did he move on already? Does he still care at all? These questions aren't about you. They're about her position, her status in your emotional world. That's why ego missing often shows up as watching from a distance, sending low-effort messages, testing the waters without vulnerability, reaching out, then pulling back again. She's not trying to rebuild. She's trying to recalibrate control, to see if the door is still open, to see if she still matters, to see if she can still access you emotionally. And if you respond too quickly, too warmly, too eagerly, the ego relaxes. The uncertainty is gone, and the missing fades just as fast as it appeared. That's why ego missing never leads to real change. It soothes insecurity, but it doesn't create growth. The second type is value missing. This one is quieter, slower, and much harder to reach. Value missing doesn't come from losing control. It comes from recognition. Recognition of what you brought. Recognition of how you showed up. Recognition of what life feels like without your presence. This kind of missing happens after time, after comparison, after failed replacements, after reflection. It's not triggered by silence alone. It's triggered by contrast. She notices that other men don't listen the way you did, don't hold space the way you did, don't provide the same emotional safety. She starts replaying moments, not to regain control, but to understand where she went wrong. Value missing sounds different internally. I didn't appreciate him. I assumed he'd always be there. I treated his patience like weakness. And here's the key difference. Ego missing asks, can I still have him? Value missing asks, did I lose something real? One is about possession. The other is about regret. And the behavior reflects that difference. When a woman is ego missing, she avoids accountability. She keeps things vague. She tests instead of commits. When a woman is value missing, she slows down. She reflects. She shows humility. She acknowledges her role. This is where men must be extremely careful. Because ego missing feels flattering. It feels like validation. It feels like power returning. But it's a trap. Responding to ego missing puts you right back into orbit, right back into predictability, right back into being taken for granted. Value missing, on the other hand, is uncomfortable for her. It requires admitting fault. It requires vulnerability. It requires risking rejection. That's why it takes longer to show up. And not every woman reaches it. Some never do. Because reflection requires emotional maturity. and maturity cannot be forced by silence. It's distance, or glow-ups alone. This is the brutal truth most men need to hear. A woman missing you does not mean she's ready for you. It only means the absence registered. What matters is why. And the only way to know is by observing behavior, not words. Does she ask about your boundaries? Does she respect your pace? Does she acknowledge the imbalance that existed? Does she take responsibility without blaming circumstances? If not, then what you're seeing is ego missing. And ego missing fades the moment reassurance returns. This chapter isn't here to tell you to hope she misses you the right way. It's here to protect you from mistaking attention for transformation. Because the man who confuses the two ends up repeating the same pain with the same person in a slightly different form. In the next chapter, we're going to explore what happens next. The phase where memory kicks in, where she starts remembering the small things she once overlooked. Why those details suddenly feel heavy, and why that nostalgia is dangerous if you don't understand it. Because memory alone is not a reason to reconnect, and understanding that is how you stop being taken for granted for good. This is the phase most men don't expect. They assume that if a woman starts missing them, it's because of something dramatic. The breakup, the silence, the glow-up. But that's not what hits first. What actually comes back to her mind are the smallest things. The things she barely noticed when you were still there. Not the big gestures. Not the sacrifices you made loudly. The quiet ones. Because memory doesn't replay what was impressive. It replays what felt safe. When your presence disappears, the brain starts filling in the gaps. And it doesn't fill them with logic. It fills them with emotion. She remembers how you texted her good morning without expecting anything in return. How you noticed when she was tired before she said a word. How you stayed calm when she was emotional. How you listened without immediately trying to fix her. At the time, these things felt normal, predictable, almost invisible. But now, without you there, they stand out, because no one else does them the same way. This is the replay phase. It doesn't happen immediately. It usually shows up after she's had time to sit in the absence, after she's tried to distract herself, after she's talked to friends, after she's told herself she's fine. Then one night, something small triggers it. A song, a place, a phrase you used to say, and suddenly, she's replaying moments she never thanked you for. Moments she assumed would always be there. This is where many men misunderstand what's happening. They think she finally realizes my worth. But what she's really realizing is the contrast. She's comparing emotional environments. And comparison always sharpens memory. When you were present, your emotional availability blended into the background. Now that it's gone, it becomes clear, not because you changed, but because the environment changed. And here's the uncomfortable truth. She didn't ignore those small things on purpose. The nervous system adapts quickly to what's consistent. What feels stable stops feeling urgent. That's why she didn't respond with gratitude. Not because she didn't care, but because she stopped noticing. And now, without you, she notices everything. The silence where your voice used to be. The lack of emotional patience from others. the absence of someone who showed up without keeping score. This is also where nostalgia becomes dangerous, because memory edits reality. It highlights comfort and minimizes conflict. She remembers how you made her feel safe. She forgets how distant she sometimes was. She remembers your patience. She forgets how she tested it. And, from the outside, this looks like regret. But inside, it's still incomplete, because remembering is not the same as taking responsibility. And this is where men often break their own progress. They see nostalgia as a signal. They interpret it as an invitation. They think, if she remembers, she must be ready. But memory alone doesn't mean growth. Memory can exist without accountability. This replay phase is about emotional recall, not emotional repair. She misses the feeling. She misses the version of herself who felt secure around you. She misses being understood without having to explain herself. But missing a feeling is not the same as being willing to protect it next time. This is the part most men skip over. They hear, "I've been thinking about you. You were always there for me. No one treats me the way you did." And they rush back, because being remembered feels validating. But validation is not transformation. The question isn't whether she remembers. The question is whether she understands why she lost access to that version of you. Without that understanding, the replay phase becomes a loop. She remembers. She reaches out. You return. The dynamic resets. And slowly, predictability returns again. And so does being taken for granted. This is why the replay phase must be observed, not acted on. You don't respond to nostalgia by offering reassurance. You respond by maintaining your center. You listen without chasing. You stay calm without withdrawing harshly. You allow space for her to process without rescuing her from discomfort. Because discomfort is what creates insight, not reassurance. Another important detail men often miss. She doesn't just replay what you did for her. She replays who you were before you started shrinking yourself, before you tried harder to compensate for distance, before you explained yourself, before you became anxious. She remembers the grounded version of you, the one who didn't seek approval, the one who gave freely without needing validation. And that version only exists when you're not trying to be chosen. That's why absence brings clarity. Not because you vanished, but because the version of you she adapted to is no longer present. And now, comparison becomes unavoidable. She compares new interactions to the emotional baseline you set. And most fall short. Not because you were perfect, but because you were genuine, emotionally available without being intrusive, supportive without being controlling. That balance is rare, and it's only felt when it's gone. But here's the Stoic truth that protects you. Someone remembering you is not the same as someone choosing you differently. Memory can exist alongside the same old patterns. The replay phase feels meaningful, but it's still incomplete, because it's focused on the past, not the future. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about the moment where everything either shifts forward or collapses back into the same cycle. The moment where men make two critical mistakes that kill their power. Because how you respond to nostalgia determines whether you grow from this or repeat it. This is where everything either changes for good or quietly collapses back into the same pattern. Not because of what she does, but because of how you respond when the dynamic finally shifts. After the silence, after the replay phase, after she starts reaching out or showing signs of missing you, this is the moment most men destroy their leverage. Not intentionally. Instinctively, there are two critical mistakes men make here, and both come from the same place. Fear, the fear of losing her again, the fear of missing the window, the fear of going back to being invisible. The first mistake is this. Mistake 1. Returning too soon. When she softens, she reaches out. Maybe it's subtle. Maybe it's emotional. Maybe it's just a, "Hey, hope you're doing well." And instantly, your nervous system lights up. This is it. She misses me. I shouldn't lose this chance. So you return fully. You reassure. You explain. You show warmth without limits. And in doing so, you erase the very contrast that made her reflect in the first place. This is the painful irony. The thing that made her start missing you was the absence of guaranteed access. When you rush back emotionally, you restore that access instantly, and the system relaxes. The uncertainty disappears. The reflection stops. The missing fades. Not because she's cruel, but because the pressure to change is gone. You've shown her that no matter what happens, your emotional availability is still free, still unconditional, still there on demand. And when availability is guaranteed again, the old dynamic quietly returns. This is why returning too soon is not an act of love. It's an act of fear. Fear of standing in the unknown long enough for real accountability to emerge. A high-value response doesn't punish. It paces. It doesn't shut her out. It refuses to rush intimacy before clarity exists. The question isn't, does she miss me? The question is, does she understand why she lost access to me without that understanding? Nothing has changed. The second mistake is just as destructive, but in a different way. Mistake 2, using silence as a weapon. Some men swing to the opposite extreme. They learn that silence is powerful, and they turn it into a tactic. They disappear completely. They ignore messages intentionally. They withhold responses to provoke anxiety. This feels strong on the surface, but psychologically, it's unstable, because silence used as punishment doesn't communicate self-respect. It communicates resentment, and resentment is loud. Even when no words are spoken, women can feel the difference immediately. Grounded silence feels calm. Weaponized silence feels hostile. One invites reflection. The other triggers defense. When silence is used to control, the nervous system doesn't open. It closes. And, instead of reflection, she feels attacked, confused, or justified in pulling away further. This is where men confuse stoicism with emotional shutdown. True stoicism isn't avoidance. It's regulation. You don't disappear to teach a lesson. You step back because you're no longer willing to participate in imbalance. That distinction matters, because silence rooted in self-respect has a different energy. It's steady. It's calm. It doesn't demand an outcome. And that's what gives it power. The goal was never to make her feel bad. The goal was to restore alignment between your actions and your worth. Which brings us to the Stoic move. The Stoic move: boundaries, clarity, and self-respect. A mature man does not rush back, and he does not stonewall. He stays present without overextending. He listens without surrendering his standards. He allows space without disappearing. If she reaches out, he responds calmly, not emotionally flooded, not distant, just grounded. And he pays attention to behavior, not words. Does she acknowledge the imbalance? Does she show curiosity about his boundaries? Does she move slower instead of rushing closeness? Most importantly, does she show accountability? Because accountability is the only sign that value missing is turning into growth. Without accountability, any reconnection is temporary. And here's the hardest truth. Sometimes she doesn't rise to meet you. Sometimes she misses you, but not enough to change. And that's where men often make their final mistake. They lower their standard to keep the connection alive. But self-respect doesn't work that way. You don't punish someone for failing to meet your standard. You simply don't negotiate it. Walking away calmly is not rejection. It's alignment. And alignment is the foundation of every healthy dynamic. This chapter isn't here to tell you how to handle her. It's here to remind you that your growth matters more than her response. Because when a man stops making decisions from fear of loss, he stops being taken for granted by anyone. In the final chapter, we're going to bring this all together, not to talk about whether she comes back, but to talk about who you become, regardless of what she chooses, because that is the only outcome that truly lasts. If there's one thing this entire video was never meant to teach you, it's how to make a woman miss you. That's where most men get it wrong. They hear about absence, silence, pulling back, and they turn it into a strategy, a way to trigger emotion, a way to regain control, a way to win someone back. But that mindset is exactly what keeps men stuck in the same cycle of being taken for granted. Because the moment your actions are driven by how she might feel, you've already given away your center. The real lesson is much simpler and much harder. You don't pull back so she misses you. You pull back so you stop abandoning yourself. That's the part no one wants to talk about. Most men don't stay too long because they're weak. They stay because they're hopeful. They believe that if they love harder, stay patient longer, give more without complaint eventually, it will be seen. Eventually, it will be appreciated. But hope without boundaries slowly turns into self-betrayal. And self-betrayal is felt, even if it's never spoken. This is why the Stoic path matters here. Stoicism isn't about being cold. It's not about emotional shutdown. It's not about pretending you don't care. It's about alignment. Alignment between what you give and what you receive. Alignment between how you show up and how you are treated. A Stoic man doesn't chase emotional debt. He doesn't keep investing where the return is respectless. And he doesn't dramatize his exit. He simply withdraws his energy from what no longer honors him. Not to punish, not to prove a point, but to return to himself. That's the shift that changes everything. When you stop overgiving, You don't become distant. You become clear. Clear about your standards. Clear about your limits. Clear about what kind of dynamic you're willing to participate in. And clarity is felt far more strongly than desperation or silence ever could be. This is why the line matters. If she comes back, it must be to a higher standard, not a louder apology, not stronger emotions, not nostalgia, but actual change, accountability, behavioral consistency, mutual effort. Because missing you is easy. Changing for you is not. And a man who understands this doesn't rush to reopen the door just because someone knocks. He asks one quiet question: has anything actually changed? If the answer is no, he doesn't argue. He doesn't explain. He simply keeps walking. That's not cruelty. That's self-respect. This is where men either evolve or repeat the pattern. Men who repeat the pattern think, maybe this time will be different. Men who evolve think, I won't negotiate the standard that protects my peace. And here's the paradox most men don't expect. The moment you truly stop needing to be seen, validated, or chosen is the moment you stop being taken for granted. Not just by women, by anyone. Because you no longer train people to access you without care. You no longer offer emotional safety at the cost of your own. You become selective, not bitter. Open but not self-sacrificing. Present but not dependent. And that version of you is the one women feel differently around. Not because he plays games, but because he's no longer trying to earn what should be mutual. This is the man who can walk away calmly without resentment. The man who can reconnect without losing his center. The man who doesn't fear loss because he knows what he brings. That's why this was never about her return. If she comes back, it should be because she meets you there, at a higher level of honesty, at a higher level of effort, at a higher level of respect. And if she doesn't, you didn't lose anything. You gained alignment. You gained self-respect. You gained the clarity that prevents this dynamic from happening again. That's the real win. So don't chase closure. Don't chase validation. Don't chase memory. Become